Welcome. This story is about a squad of soldiers sent to investigate an abandoned listening post where the last transmission spoke of seeing the face of illumination. What they find is a signal officer still alive, his eyes burned out and mouth full of glowing wax, and something far worse wandering the trenches at night, a floating head with a mouth like a lantern that shows anyone who looks inside the horrific truth of their own sins. As the squad forgets why they came, then who they are, then how to leave, they discover that some revelations are more terrifying than any enemy they've ever faced. Now, let us begin. The listening post crouched in the mud like a wounded animal, its corrugated iron walls bleeding rust into the black soil. Sergeant Matthias Krell pressed his face against the periscope, watching the amber glow that pulsed from within the abandoned structure. 3 days had passed since Signal Officer Hendrick's last transmission, a garbled mess of static and whispered prayers that ended with the sound of something wet hitting the floor. The new syncretic Orthodox had built this outpost 6 months ago, when the heretic legion still held the ridge beyond the crater field. Now the ridge was theirs, but the listening post remained dark, save for that strange light that flickered through the cracks in its armor, plating like candlelight through broken teeth. Krell lowered the periscope and turned to his squad. 5 men huddled in the communication trench, their faces pale beneath layers of sacred mud and blessed soot. Private Oswin clutched his relic engine rifle, its brass workings clicking softly as the blessed mechanisms calibrated themselves. Corporal Vance worked his prayer beads through fingers black with trench rot, while the twins, Casper and Klaus, shared a can of sanctified rations with the mechanical precision of men who had forgotten how to taste. Behind them all, Father Erasmus knelt in the mud, his once white vestments now the color of old blood and battlefield smoke. The priest's lips moved in constant prayer, but Krell could see the doubt festering in his eyes like an infection. 3 months in the trenches had aged the holy man a decade, and his faith leaked away with each unanswered prayer. "The light grows stronger," Krell said, his voice barely audible above the distant thunder of artillery. "Signal Command reports the glow can be seen from the observation balloons." Oswin's rifle clicked again, a nervous sound in the wet silence. "Could be a trap, Sergeant. Heretics might have rigged the place with phosphorus charges." "Phosphorus burns white," Vance murmured, his prayer beads clicking like insect legs. "This light is yellow, golden, like the halos in the old icons." Father Erasmus looked up from his prayers, mud caked in his beard. "There are no halos here, my son. Only shadows wearing crowns of thorns." The twins said nothing, but Krell saw how their eyes kept drifting toward the listening post. Something about their shared gaze made his skin crawl. In 3 years of trench warfare, he had learned to trust his instincts about wrongness, and everything about this felt wrong. A sound drifted across the crater field, faint as a whisper in a cathedral. It might have been wind through broken metal, or it might have been singing. The melody, if it was a melody, seemed to burrow into Krell's skull and nest there like a parasite. "Orders are orders," he said, more to convince himself than his men. Hendrick might still be alive. Command wants the listening post secured and operational. Father Erasmus stood, his joints creaking like old pews. "I have blessed your ammunition and sanctified your souls, but some places are beyond the reach of prayer. If we enter that structure, we may find more than we seek." "And less than we hope," Vance added, his beads clicking faster now. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was definitely singing, though the words were lost in the wind. The melody seemed familiar, like a half-remembered hymn from childhood, but every note felt somehow inverted, as if the song were being sung backwards through a mouth full of honey. Krell checked his watch. 17 minutes past midnight, the witching hour. His grandmother would have called it, though she had died long before the Hellgate opened and made every hour cursed. "Move out," he ordered, shouldering his pack. Standard formation, Oswin on point, twins covering the flanks. "Father, you stay in the middle with Vance. And remember what we learned at New Antioch. Some enemies can only be fought with prayer." They climbed from the trench and began their approach across the cratered field. The ground squelched beneath their boots, releasing pockets of gas that smelled like sulfur and rotting incense. Crater holes filled with black water reflected the strange light from the listening post, creating dozens of golden eyes that watched their progress. As they drew closer, details emerged from the gloom. The structure's walls were scarred with what looked like claw marks, too large and too deep to have been made by mortal hands. The door hung open on twisted hinges, and that amber light poured forth like liquid fire, pooling in the mud around the threshold. Oswin raised his fist, signaling a halt 20 yards from the entrance. His relic engine rifle hummed as its blessed components detected something unnatural ahead. The weapon's brass workings glowed faintly, responding to whatever unholy presence lurked within. "Movement," Oswin whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something's inside." Through the open doorway, they could see the interior of the listening post. Banks of communication equipment lined the walls, their screens dark except for one that flickered with golden static. Maps and duty rosters hung from hooks like shedskin, and the floor was ankle-deep in what looked like melted wax. In the center of the room sat Signal Officer Hendrik. He was still alive, though alive seemed too generous a word for his condition. The man sat perfectly upright in his chair, hands folded in his lap, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. His uniform was pristine, untouched by the wax that pooled around his feet, but his face told a different story. Where his eyes should have been, there were only blackened sockets that wept tears of molten gold. His mouth hung open, and from within came that soft, constant light, as if he had swallowed a star. Wax dripped from his lips in a steady stream, adding to the pool that covered the floor. "Holy Mother of God," Father Erasmus breathed, making the sign of the cross with shaking fingers. Hendrik's head turned toward them with mechanical precision. The light in his mouth pulsed brighter, and when he spoke, his voice was like honey poured over broken glass. "I have seen the face of illumination," he said, each word accompanied by a fresh rivulet of golden wax. "I have gazed upon the truth that burns behind all lies, and now I burn with it." Krell felt his throat constrict. 3 days ago, Hendrik had been a competent, if unremarkable soldier, a man who complained about the food and wrote letters to a sweetheart in Stuttgart. Now he sat like a religious icon carved from flesh and madness, his ruined eyes weeping liquid light. "Hendrik," Krell called softly, "can you hear me? Do you know who I am?" The signal officer's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could hold such terrible knowledge. "I know all names now, Sergeant. I know the secret names of every star and the true names of every sin. Would you like me to tell you yours?" The twins stepped closer together, their identical faces pale with fear. Casper's lips moved in silent prayer while Klaus gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The weapon's relic engine components hummed higher, sensing danger but unable to identify its source. The face came to me in the third watch, Hendrik continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. It rose from the communication static like a sun from black water, beautiful beyond description and terrible beyond comprehension. It showed me the truth of this war, the truth of our crusade, the truth of every prayer ever spoken in the mud. Father Erasmus stepped forward, his holy symbol clutched in both hands. This is heresy, my son. You speak of visions, but God's truth does not burn out mortal eyes. Does it not? Hendrik's head tilted further, an impossible angle that should have snapped his neck. Then explain the burning bush, Father. Explain the pillar of fire. Explain why Moses came down from the mountain with his face so bright that men could not look upon it. The priest faltered, his symbol wavering in his grip. In the trenches, faith was a fragile thing, worn thin by the daily horror of warfare between heaven and hell. Every doubt was a crack where darkness could seep in, and Hendrik's words found those cracks with surgical precision. The difference, Hendrik continued, is that Moses looked away. I did not. I stared into the face of illumination until it filled my vision, until it burned away everything false and left only truth. And the truth, Father, is that we are already dead. We died the moment we set foot in these trenches, and everything since has been the fever dream of corpses who refuse to acknowledge their condition. Vance's prayer beads snapped, scattering across the muddy ground like fallen teeth. The man himself stood frozen, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to form words of denial or prayer. The light in Hendrik's mouth pulsed again, brighter now, and Krell could see shapes moving within it. Not flames, but something more solid, more purposeful. Faces, perhaps, or hands reaching toward some impossible distance. You want to know what I saw, Hendrik said, and it was not a question. You want to understand the face of illumination. Come closer, and I will show you. I will open my mouth like a lantern, and you will see your sins written in letters of fire. You will see every lie you have told yourself, every false comfort you have clutched in the darkness of these trenches. Oswin's rifle clicked repeatedly now, its blessed mechanism struggling to process whatever they were detecting. The weapon's brass workings had begun to glow more brightly, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the listening post. "We should leave," the private whispered. "This place is cursed." But even as he spoke, Krell felt the pull of that impossible light. It called to something deep in his chest, some hunger he had never acknowledged. The promise of truth, of illumination, of an end to the endless questions that plagued every soldier in this damned war. What if Hendrik was right? What if they were already dead, already beyond salvation or damnation? What if the light in his mouth held answers to questions that had tormented mankind since the Hellgate opened? "Stay back," Father Erasmus commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. The priest's own eyes were fixed on the golden glow, and Krell could see the terrible temptation written across his muddy features. Hendrik began to laugh, a sound like church bells cast in hell. The light in his mouth flared, and suddenly the air was full of whispers. Dozens of voices, speaking in languages both familiar and alien, all carrying the same message. Come closer, see the truth, burn away the lies. The wax on the floor began to move, flowing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. It formed symbols that might have been letters in some ancient script, or might have been the tracks of things that crawled on too many legs. "One look," Hendrik promised, his voice multiplying until it seemed to come from every corner of the listening post. "One glimpse into the lantern of my mouth, and you will understand everything. The purpose of this war, the meaning of your suffering, the reason why God allows hell to walk the earth." Krell took a step forward before he could stop himself. The mud squelched beneath his boot, and he felt something give way, as if he had stepped through more than just physical space. Behind him, someone screamed. It was Klaus, one of the twins, his face contorted in an expression of absolute terror. He pointed past them all, toward the far wall of the listening post, where something impossible had begun to manifest. A head, floating 3 feet above the ground, roughly the size of a man but somehow more and less than human. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched taut over features that seemed to shift whenever he wasn't looking directly at them. But it was the mouth that held his attention, a gaping maw that glowed from within like a furnace door left ajar. The floating head turned toward them with the slow deliberation of a predator selecting its prey. When it spoke, its voice was Hendrik's voice multiplied 100-fold, as if an entire choir were singing through his throat. "Behold," it said, "the face of illumination." Oswin's rifle fired, the blessed ammunition tearing through the air where the head had been, but the creature simply moved, flowing through space like water through a broken dam. The bullets passed harmlessly through its form and embedded themselves in the wall behind, their blessed silver smoking against the corrupted metal. The twins broke ranks, running for the door, but they made it only 3 steps before the thing's mouth opened wider. Light poured forth, not the warm golden glow of before, but something sharper, more focused. It caught Klaus first, washing over him like a tide of liquid fire. The young soldier stopped running. His rifle fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against the wax-covered floor. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound emerged. Instead, his eyes began to weep, the same golden tears that marked Hendrik's face. "I see," Klaus whispered, his voice filled with wonder and horror in equal measure. "I see what I did to the children in Verdun. I see how I enjoyed it." His brother, Casper, spun around, reaching for Klaus, but it was too late. The light had done its work, burning away whatever mental barriers had allowed Klaus to function, to fight, to live with the weight of his actions. Now he stood paralyzed by the perfect clarity of his own moral corruption, seeing himself as the monster he had always been, but had never been forced to acknowledge. The floating head drifted closer, its mouth still agape, still pouring forth that terrible illumination. Krell could see more clearly now what moved within that light. Not flames, but memories. His memories. The time he had shot the wounded heretic rather than waste medical supplies. The village he had burned because its people looked at him with the wrong expression. The prayer he had whispered over the body of his best friend, thanking God that it was Marcus who had died and not him. "No," he breathed, but the word had no power here. The light was already reaching for him, eager to show him every moment of cowardice, every act of cruelty, every selfish thought that had crossed his mind in 3 years of trench warfare. Father Erasmus stepped between Krell and the floating head, his holy symbol raised like a shield, in nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. he began, but the Latin words crumbled in his mouth like ash. The head's attention fixed on him, and Krell saw the priest's face go white as bone. "Ah," the head said, its voice like honey mixed with venom. "A man of God. How delicious. Tell me, Father, when did you first begin to doubt? Was it when the hell gate opened and your prayers went unanswered? Was it when you watched children die of plague in New Antioch? Or was it earlier, in the seminary, when you realized that you had taken holy vows not from love of God but from fear of living in the world?" The priest's symbol fell from shaking hands. His mouth moved in desperate prayer, but no words came. The light from the creature's mouth had found him, had penetrated whatever armor faith had provided, and now he saw himself clearly for the first time in decades. "I wanted to be important," Father Erasmus whispered, tears cutting tracks through the mud on his cheeks. "I wanted to matter. I never believed. I just wanted to wear the robes and have people listen when I spoke." The admission hung in the air like incense, and Krell felt something fundamental shift around them. The listening post no longer felt like a military structure but like a confessional, a place where sins were laid bare and weighed in balances that had nothing to do with human justice. Vance had collapsed to his knees, staring at his scattered prayer beads as if they were the remains of his murdered faith. His lips moved constantly, but instead of prayers, he whispered a litany of names. Women's names, spoken with the tone of a man reciting a catalog of his crimes. Only Oswin remained standing, his rifle trained on the floating head despite the obvious futility of the gesture. But even he was beginning to waver, his eyes wide and staring as the creature's influence worked on his mind. The head drifted closer to Krell, and he could smell the honey-sweet scent of the wax that dripped from its mouth. Up close, he could see that its features were not quite human after all. The eyes were too large, too knowing, and the skin had a translucent quality that revealed the movement of things beneath. Veins, perhaps, or worms. "You are wondering," the head said, its voice now intimate, conversational, "whether this is hell, whether you have died and been damned for your sins. But the truth is so much worse than that, Sergeant Krell. You are still alive. This is still Earth, and what you see before you is not a demon, but an angel." The words hit Krell like a physical blow. An angel, the face of illumination, the thing that had burned out Hendrik's eyes and filled his mouth with light, was one of heaven's own. "Impossible," he breathed. But even as he spoke, he felt the terrible logic of it. An angel of truth, come to show them the reality of their condition. Come to illuminate the darkness of their souls with perfect, unbearable clarity. "The war has gone on too long," the angel continued, its mouth never quite closing, light spilling forth with every word. 900 years of conflict between heaven and hell, and what have we accomplished? Nothing but the multiplication of suffering. So I have come to bring an end to illusion, to show all warriors the true nature of their cause." Behind Hendrik, still sitting in his chair like a grotesque puppet, the communication equipment began to crackle to life. But instead of voices or static, the speakers emitted that same honey-sweet singing they had heard across the crater field. The melody was clearer now, and Krell recognized it as a hymn he had learned as a child. But the words were wrong, inverted, a prayer spoken backwards until it became something else entirely. The floating head's attention drifted to Oswin, who still stood with his rifle raised despite the futility of the gesture. The young private's face was pale as snow, and sweat ran down his cheeks like tears. "Private Oswin," the angel said, its voice gentle as a mother's lullaby. "You have killed 63 men in this war. You keep count, do you not? Each one carved into your memory like notches on a gun stock. Would you like to meet them?" The light from the creature's mouth reached out like fingers, touching Oswin's face with gossamer softness. The private's rifle fell from nerveless hands, and his mouth opened in a silent cry of recognition. "Johannes," he whispered, staring at something only he could see. "Mein Gott, Johannes, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you had children." The light played across his features, and Krell could see the private's sanity cracking like ice under pressure. Each name was another fracture, another memory, made vivid and immediate. The boy from Prague whose throat he had cut in the dark, the officer whose back he had shot while the man knelt in prayer, the wounded soldier he had bayoneted rather than take prisoner. One by one, they rose before him in perfect detail, summoned by the angel's terrible mercy, not as they had been in life, but as they were now, after years in the mud of contested battlefields. Rotting, accusatory, their eyes filled with the patient hunger of the wronged, dead. Oswin began to weep, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. "They won't stop looking at me," he said, his voice breaking like a child's. "They won't stop." The angel's laughter was like wind chimes made from human bones. "Why should they stop? You took their lives. Now, they take your peace. It is only fair." Krell tried to look away, but found his eyes drawn irresistibly back to the creature's mouth. The light within had begun to shift and swirl, forming new patterns, new revelations. He could see his own face reflected in that glow, but it was not the face he remembered. This was the face of a killer, a man who had traded his humanity for survival and called it duty. "You begin to understand," the angel said, noting his expression. "The face of illumination shows all things as they truly are, stripped of the comfortable lies that allow mortals to function. Your commanders sent you here to rescue a signal officer and secure a listening post. But I have given you something far more valuable. I have given you truth." Behind the angel, Hendrik began to rise from his chair. The movement was wrong, too fluid, as if his bones had been replaced with something more flexible. Wax continued to pour from his mouth, but now it formed words as it fell, brief messages in a script that seemed to writhe and change when viewed directly. "The truth burns," Hendrik said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It burns away lies, burns away hope, burns away the illusion of purpose. What remains is pure, perfect understanding. We are insects, scuttling about in the mud, and our war is the buzzing of flies to those who truly matter." Father Erasmus looked up from where he knelt in the wax, his face streaked with tears of recognition. "Then God has abandoned us." "No," the angel replied, its mouth opening wider, releasing more of that terrible light. "God is here. God is watching. God is laughing." The sound that came from the creature's throat might have been laughter, or it might have been screaming. In the enclosed space of the listening post, it reverberated until Krell could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in the soft tissues of his brain. Around them, the walls began to change, The corrugated iron was melting, flowing like water, reforming into shapes that suggested architecture but followed no earthly geometry. Windows opened where none had been before, showing views of landscapes that existed nowhere on any map. Burning deserts where the sand was made of powdered bone. Forests of trees that grew downward into empty sky. Cities built from crystallized screams. "Where are we?" Vance whispered, still staring at his scattered prayer beads as if they might somehow reassemble themselves and restore his shattered faith. "We are where we have always been," the angel replied, "in the space between heaven and hell, in the place where truth lives. The listening post was merely a door, and you have walked through it of your own free will." Krell felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, not physically but in some deeper way that made his inner ear scream warnings of vertigo. The mud was no longer mud but something softer, more yielding. Something that felt disturbingly like flesh. The twins stood together near what had once been the entrance, but the doorway now opened onto a corridor that stretched away into impossible distances. Klaus still wept his golden tears, while Casper stared at his brother with an expression of dawning horror. "What did you do?" Casper whispered. "In Verdun, what did you do?" But Klaus could not answer. The angel's light had taken his voice, leaving him only the ability to weep and remember. Every atrocity played out behind his eyes in perfect detail, every moment of cruelty rendered with photographic clarity. The communication equipment around Hendrik's chair continued to sing its backwards hymns, and now other voices had joined the chorus. Voices from other listening posts, other signal officers who had received similar visits from the angel. A network of illumination spreading across the battlefield, touching every unit, every trench, every dugout where men huddled in the dark and tried to pretend their cause was just. "How many?" Krell asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. "All of them," the angel replied with evident satisfaction. "Every soldier, every priest, every commander who thinks he serves a righteous cause. Each will look into the lantern of truth and see themselves as they really are. The war will end, not through victory or defeat, but through the simple recognition that those who fight it are unworthy of the causes they claim to serve." Oswin had collapsed beside his rifle, his hands pressed to his eyes as if he could somehow shut out the visions that tormented him. But the dead do not require sight to make themselves known. They whispered in his ears, touched his face with fingers made of memory and regret. "Make it stop," he pleaded, rocking back and forth like a child. "Please, make it stop." "Why would I do that?" the angel asked, its voice full of genuine curiosity. "You made it start. Every time you pulled a trigger, every time you drew a blade, you invited them into your life. Now they are here to stay." Father Erasmus struggled to his feet, his vestments heavy with wax and something darker. When he spoke, his voice was hollow as a bell with its clapper torn out. "If this is God's will," he said, "then God is not good." "Good," the angel repeated, as if tasting the word. "What is good?" "You have spent 3 years killing men who pray to the same divine source you claim to serve, and you call it good because your commanders tell you to. You have burned villages and salted fields and called it good because a book written by men says your enemies are heretics. Good is a word humans use to make themselves feel better about their appetites." The priest's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "Then why do you serve him?" "Who says I serve anyone?" the angel replied, and its mouth curved in something that might have been a smile if smiles could hold such perfect malice. I am truth, and truth serves only itself. I care nothing for heaven or hell, only for the moment when illusion falls away and reality stands naked in the light. Krell felt something fundamental break inside his chest, some core belief that had held him together through 3 years of horror. If the angel was right, if it spoke truth without agenda or loyalty, then everything was meaningless. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every small act of mercy or courage was just noise in the dark, signifying nothing. "You're lying," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. "Am I?" The angel drifted closer, its mouth opening wider, releasing more of that honey-scented light. "Look into the lantern, Sergeant. See the truth of your own nature. See what you really are." The light reached for him, and Krell saw his reflection in its glow. But it was not one reflection but dozens, each showing a different moment from his time in the trenches. The boy he had strangled because the child's crying might have alerted the enemy. The wounded horse he had shot, not to end its suffering but because its neighing annoyed him. The letter he had written to his sister, full of lies about heroism and honor, when the truth was that he felt nothing but empty appetite for violence. Each image was perfect in its clarity, unmarked by the comfortable distortions of memory or self-justification. He saw himself as he truly was, a killer who had learned to enjoy killing, a man who had traded his humanity for the simple pleasure of power over life and death. "No," he whispered, but the word had no force. The angel's truth was irrefutable, written in light that burned away all possibility of denial. Behind him, Vance began to laugh. It was not a pleasant sound, more like the chattering of insects than human mirth. The man had given up trying to gather his scattered prayer beads and instead sat in the wax, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I never loved any of them," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Sarah, Maria, Catherine, all the others. I just wanted to possess them, to own them completely. When they resisted, when they tried to leave, I made sure they couldn't. I made sure no one would ever find the bodies." The admission hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Krell had served with Vance for 2 years, had trusted the man with his life on a dozen occasions, and had never suspected the depths of corruption that lay beneath his companion's careful facade. But then, he realized, the same could be said of all of them. The twins with their matching faces and matching sins. Father Erasmus, with his hollow faith and desperate need for relevance. Oswin with his carefully maintained count of the dead. And himself, with his appetite for violence and his talent for self-deception. They were all monsters, and the angel had simply held up a mirror. The floating head began to sing, its voice joining the backwards hymn that poured from the communication equipment. The melody was beautiful in its way, like cathedral music played in reverse, each note perfectly placed to create maximum emotional impact. But the effect was not transcendence, but collapse, a falling away of everything that had once seemed solid and true. Around them, the transformed listening post continued to shift and change. The walls were now completely transparent, offering views of battlefields that existed in no earthly geography. Krell could see other squads, other platoons, all paralyzed by their own revelations as angels of truth moved among them like shepherds tending a flock of the damned. In one window, he saw a group of Hebrew knights kneeling in their trench, their ancient armor tarnished and their sacred swords fallen from nerveless fingers. An angel much like the one before him hovered above them, its mouth pouring forth light that revealed the pride and cruelty hidden beneath their noble vows. In another, a company of trench pilgrims sat in their dugout like broken dolls, their eyes weeping tears of molten gold as they stared into visions of their own making. Their leader, a man Krell recognized as Captain Mordecai the Blessed, rocked back and forth while muttering a litany of names. Children's names, spoken with the reverence of a man cataloging his most precious possessions. Every unit, every faction, every soldier who had ever claimed to fight for righteousness was receiving the same gift of illumination. The angel's influence spread like plague, carried by radio waves and shared glances, by whispered confessions and the simple recognition that they were all the same underneath their different uniforms and conflicting prayers. "Beautiful, is it not?" the angel said, noting Krell's attention to the windows. 900 years of war, and finally, perfect understanding. No more lies about holy causes or righteous battles. Just truth, pure and undiluted. Hendrik stood fully now, though his posture was wrong, bent at angles that should have caused him agony. Wax continued to flow from his mouth, pooling at his feet in patterns that seemed to spell out words in a dozen different languages. All the same message repeated endlessly. The truth burns, the truth illuminates, the truth sets you free. Free from what? Krell found himself asking, though he was not sure why he bothered. The answer seemed obvious enough. Free from hope, the angel replied, its mouth opening wider still. Free from the burden of believing that your actions matter, that your choices have meaning, that there is some grand purpose to your suffering. Hope is the cruelest lie of all, Sergeant. It keeps men fighting long after they should lay down their arms and accept their fate. Father Erasmus laughed again, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. So this is your mercy, to show us that we are damned and always have been. Mercy assumes judgment, the angel said. I do not judge, I simply reveal. What you do with the revelation is your own choice. But even as it spoke, Krell could see that choice was an illusion. How could a man choose to act when he had seen himself so clearly, when every impulse toward nobility or sacrifice had been revealed as elaborate self-deception? How could a soldier fight when he knew that his cause was no more righteous than his enemies, that his God was no more real than the devils he claimed to oppose? The twins had begun to move toward each other, their identical faces set in expressions of dawning understanding. Casper reached out to touch his brother's cheek, wiping away the golden tears that still flowed from Klaus's ruined eyes. I did it too, Casper whispered. Not children, but close enough. The old woman in Strasbourg. I told myself it was necessary, that she might have been a spy. But I knew she wasn't. I knew she was just afraid, and I wanted to hurt something that was afraid. The confession seemed to break the spell that held Klaus silent. His mouth opened, releasing a sound that was part sob and part sigh of relief. We are the same, he said, his voice wondering. We always were, even before the angel came. We pretended to be different people, but we were always the same monster, wearing two faces. They embraced then, brother holding brother, sharing the weight of their mutual corruption. It should have been touching, Krell thought, this moment of honesty between siblings. Instead, it felt like watching two parasites merge into something larger and more terrible. The angel observed their reunion with evident satisfaction. Truth creates its own bonds, it said. When illusion falls away, what remains is often stronger than what came before. Oswin had stopped weeping and now sat with his back against the wall, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The dead still whispered to him. Krell could tell, but he seemed to have found some way to coexist with their accusations. Perhaps madness, or perhaps simple acceptance of his nature. "What happens now?" Oswin asked, his voice flat and emotionless. "Do we go back to our units? Do we report what we found? Do we continue the war?" "You cannot go back," the angel replied. "The door through which you entered has closed, but you need not continue forward either. You can simply remain here, in this place between places, free from the need to pretend that your actions have meaning." Krell looked around the transformed listening post, at the windows that showed impossible vistas and the walls that flowed like water. It was not unpleasant, he realized. There was a certain peace in the absence of choice, a relief in no longer having to carry the weight of moral responsibility. But something in him, some stubborn fragment of whatever he had been before the angel's revelation, rebelled at the idea of simply accepting this fate. "No," he said, and was surprised to hear his own voice. "This is wrong." The angel's attention fixed on him with the intensity of a searchlight, its mouth curved upward, not quite a smile, and the light within pulsed with what might have been amusement or hunger. "Wrong?" it repeated, tasting the word like wine. "What is wrong, Sergeant? That you have been shown the truth? That the comfortable lies you have lived by have been stripped away? Or is it wrong that you finally see yourself clearly?" Krell felt the weight of those burning eyes, but something in him refused to bend. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the last flicker of whatever spark had once made him human. "You call this truth, but all I see is despair. Truth should illuminate, not destroy." "And who told you that?" the angel asked, drifting closer. The honey scent of its breath was overwhelming now, thick as syrup and twice as cloying. "Your priests, your commanders. The same men who sent you to die in muddy holes while they planned strategy from comfortable rooms." Father Erasmus looked up from where he knelt in the wax, his face a map of broken faith. "The boy speaks heresy, but perhaps heresy is all that remains to us now." "Not heresy," Krell said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Just refusal. You show us our sins as if they are the sum total of what we are. But what about the moments between the murders? What about the times we chose mercy when we could have chosen cruelty?" The angel's laughter was like glass breaking in a cathedral. "Mercy? When did you ever choose mercy, Sergeant? Each act of kindness you remember was calculation. Each moment of restraint was fear. Strip away the self-serving narrative, and what remains?" But even as it spoke, Krell found himself remembering. Not the careful edited version he had carried through 3 years of war, but something rawer, more immediate. The wounded heretic he had dragged to safety, even though the man had tried to kill him. The horse he had shot, yes. But first he had tried to heal its wounds, spending precious medical supplies on an animal that could give him nothing in return. The letters to his sister, full of lies about heroism. But underneath those lies, a desperate need to preserve something innocent in a world gone mad. "I remember choosing," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, like a language he had almost forgotten how to speak. Not always, not even often. But I remember the choice being there, and sometimes I made it. The twins looked up from their embrace, their identical faces wearing expressions of confusion. Klaus wiped at his golden tears with the back of his hand, smearing the liquid light across his cheek like war paint. "But the children," Klaus whispered. "In Verdun, I enjoyed it." "Yes," Krell said, not looking away from the floating head. "You did, and that is part of what you are. But it is not all of what you are." The angel's mouth opened wider, releasing a torrent of that terrible illuminating light. It washed over Krell like a tide of molten gold, and he saw himself again in perfect clarity. Every sin, every moment of weakness, every choice that had led him further from the man he had once hoped to become. But he saw something else as well, the space between the sins, the moments of hesitation before each atrocity, the part of him that had recoiled even as his hands moved to do violence. It was small, that part, worn thin by 3 years of war and compromise, but it existed, fragile as a candle flame in a hurricane but stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. "Interesting," the angel said, its voice taking on a note of genuine curiosity. "You see the same truths as the others, but you draw different conclusions. How do you reconcile the contradiction? How do you hold both your cruelty and your compassion in the same mind without madness?" "I don't know," Krell admitted, "but the contradiction exists whether I understand it or not. Maybe that's what makes us human. Not our capacity for good or evil, but our ability to contain both and still choose." Oswin stirred from his place against the wall, the dead no longer whispering quite as loudly in his ears. "Choice," he repeated, as if the word were foreign. "But how do you choose when you know what you are? How do you act when you've seen the truth of your own nature?" "The same way you chose before," Krell said, though he was not entirely sure he believed his own words. "One moment at a time, one decision at a time. The knowledge changes nothing except the excuses we make to ourselves." Father Erasmus struggled to his feet, his vestments heavy with wax and disillusionment. "But if God does not exist, if our prayers are just noise in the void, what meaning can our choices have?" "The same meaning they always had," Krell replied. "The meaning we give them." The angel's laughter filled the transformed space, echoing off walls that were no longer quite solid. "Philosophy," it said, the word dripping with contempt. "You cling to abstractions because the concrete truth is too heavy to bear. Very well. Let us test your convictions." The light from its mouth suddenly intensified. No longer the warm honey glow of before, but something sharper, more focused. It struck Krell like a physical blow, driving him to his knees in the pool of wax that covered the floor. Images flooded his mind, not memories this time, but possibilities. He saw himself walking back through the crater field, leaving his squad behind to face whatever fate awaited them in this place between places. He saw himself returning to the trenches, reporting the listening post lost, accepting a commendation for surviving when his men did not. He saw himself growing old in a world where the war finally ended, not through victory or defeat, but through the simple exhaustion of armies that no longer remembered why they fought. He saw himself in a comfortable chair by a warm fire, telling sanitized stories of his service to grandchildren who would never know the weight of the choices he had made. It was seductive, that vision of escape, All he had to do was stand up, walk to what had once been the door, and choose to leave. The angel would let him go, he knew. It had no interest in forcing revelations on those who genuinely rejected them. Its power lay in the willing acceptance of truth, not in coercion. But as he knelt in the wax, feeling its warmth seep through his uniform, Krell found himself thinking of Hendrik. The signal officer still stood beside his chair, mouth agape, pouring light and wisdom into the darkness. He had looked into the face of illumination and been transformed by it, but was transformation the same thing as destruction? "Hendrik," Krell called softly. "Can you hear me?" The signal officer's head turned with that same mechanical precision as before, but something in his posture had changed. The terrible rigidity was gone, replaced by something that might have been peace. "I hear you, Sergeant," Hendrik said. His voice no longer multiplied but simply his own, though it still carried that honey, sweet undertone. "I hear everything now. The radio signals from across the battlefield, the prayers of dying men, the last words of the fallen. All of it flows through me like water through a broken dam." "Are you still human?" Krell asked, though he was not sure what answer he hoped to receive. Hendrik considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Wax continued to drip from his mouth, but slowly now, each drop deliberate and purposeful. "I am what I chose to become when I looked into the face of illumination," he said finally. "I saw the truth of what I was, and I chose to let it burn away everything false. What remains is not what I was, but it is not less than what I was either. It is simply different. Do you regret it?" "Regret requires the ability to imagine having chosen differently," Hendrik replied. "I cannot imagine that now. The choice was made not just by me, but by everything I had ever been, every moment that led me to that chair, that radio, that particular night when the signal came through the static. It was always going to happen this way." The angel watched this exchange with evident interest, its mouth partially closed for the first time since they had entered the listening post. "You begin to understand," it said to Krell. "Your friend has achieved a kind of perfection. He is no longer burdened by the need to pretend that his nature is other than it is." "But he's not free," Krell said, the realization hitting him with the force of revelation. "He's trapped by that same nature, unable to choose anything other than what he is." "Freedom is an illusion," the angel replied. "We are all trapped by our natures, limited by the boundaries of what we can conceive and execute. The only choice is whether to acknowledge those boundaries or to live in denial of them." Vance laughed from where he sat among his scattered prayer beads, the sound sharp and brittle. "Listen to us," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "Debating philosophy while we kneel in a pool of demon wax, having confessed to crimes that would damn us in any sane world. We are already lost, all of us. The only question is whether we admit it." "Demon wax," the angel repeated, and its mouth curved in that not quite smile again. "You still think in terms of heaven and hell, of good and evil, of salvation and damnation. But what if those categories are as false as everything else you have believed? What if there is only truth and illusion, revelation and blindness?" Krell felt something shift in his understanding, a fundamental reordering of assumptions he had carried since childhood. If the angel was right, if the moral framework he had inherited was just another comfortable lie, then perhaps damnation was not a destination but a perspective. Perhaps hell was simply the state of seeing clearly without the ability to change what was seen. The twins had separated, but they remained close, their identical faces turned toward the floating head with expressions of growing comprehension. Casper reached out to touch the air where the angel's light was strongest, and his fingertips came away stained with something that might have been honey or might have been gold. "We could stay," Klaus said softly. "We could remain here and let the truth burn through us until nothing false remains. Would that be better than returning to the world with this knowledge?" "Better for whom?" Krell asked. Though he was no longer sure, he believed in concepts like better or worse. For us, for the war, for the men who are still fighting because they haven't seen what we've seen. The angel's attention fixed on him again, and he felt the weight of its ancient wisdom pressing against his thoughts like a physical force. "You think you have a responsibility to warn them, to spread the revelation I have given you, but consider the consequences of such an action." Images flashed through Krell's mind, visions of what would happen if the angel's influence spread unchecked. Armies laying down their weapons not in surrender but in simple recognition of futility. Cities emptying as their populations wandered into the countryside, no longer able to maintain the pretense that their lives had meaning. Civilization itself crumbling as the foundations of shared belief dissolved under the weight of perfect clarity. "Not extinction," the angel said, reading his thoughts. "Transformation, the end of one kind of existence and the beginning of another. Is that not what your prophets promised? The old world passing away and a new world being born?" Father Erasmus made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been laughter. "The kingdom of heaven," he said, his voice hollow as an empty tomb. "I preached about it for 20 years, never imagining it might look like this." "Like what?" Krell asked, genuinely curious. "Like truth without comfort," the priest replied. "Like knowledge without hope. Like God's love revealed as perfect indifference." The floating head began to drift toward the far wall of the transformed listening post, where the windows showed battles that raged across impossible landscapes. In one, knights in tarnished armor fought creatures that might once have been men. In another, angels and demons worked side by side to tend a garden where the flowers were made of crystallized tears. "The choice is before you," the angel said, its voice beginning to fade as distance increased. "Remain here and let the truth complete its work, or return to a world that will no longer make sense to eyes that have seen clearly. Either path leads to the same destination, but the journey differs." Krell looked around at his squad, these men he had served with and trusted and never really known. Oswin, still haunted by his personal legion of the dead but no longer paralyzed by their presence. The twins, clinging to each other in their shared corruption like two halves of a broken mirror. Vance, sitting among the ruins of his faith and finding a strange peace in the absence of hope. Father Erasmus, his vestments stained with wax and disillusionment, but his eyes clearer than they had been in years. And Hendrik, transformed beyond recognition but somehow more himself than he had ever been, a conduit for truths too large for mortal minds to contain unchanged. "We can't go back," Krell said, the words emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Even if we wanted to, even if the door were still open, we've seen too much." "Then what do we do?" Oswin asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than despair. Krell stood slowly, wax dripping from his uniform like tears of liquid gold. Around them, the listening post continued its slow transformation, walls flowing like water, windows opening onto vistas that existed nowhere in the world they had known. "We go forward," he said, not because he understood what that meant, but because forward was the only direction that remained. "We carry what we've learned and see what becomes of us." The angel paused in its drift toward the far wall, its mouth opening one final time to release a burst of that honey-sweet light. "Wisdom," it said, and there might have been approval in its voice, or there might have been pity. "The rarest choice of all." Father Erasmus rose to his feet, his movements steady despite the weight of his transformed understanding. "If we are to be pilgrims in a world that no longer makes sense," he said, "then perhaps we should begin by choosing a direction." Krell nodded, though he was not sure which way they should go, or what they might find when they arrived. The windows showed 100 different battlefields, 1,000 different possibilities. Some looked familiar, others seemed to belong to wars that had not yet been fought or had been abandoned before they could begin. But as he watched, one window began to glow more brightly than the others. It showed a simple scene, a field of unmarked graves under a sky the color of old blood. Standing among the graves was a figure in tattered robes, planting flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names. "There," Krell said, pointing toward the window. "We go there." "Why?" Vance asked, gathering the scattered remains of his prayer beads not from faith, but from simple habit. "Because it looks like the kind of place where truth and beauty might coexist," Krell replied, though even as he spoke, he wondered if he was simply choosing another comfortable lie. The angel laughed one final time, a sound like wind through a broken organ. "Perhaps," it said, "or perhaps you will discover that beauty is simply another name for the lies we tell ourselves about suffering. Either way, the choice is made." It drifted through the far wall and was gone, leaving behind only the fading echo of its honey-sweet breath and the memory of illumination that could never be unseen. Hendrik stepped away from his chair, leaving behind the communication equipment that still sang its backwards hymns to an audience of ghosts and madmen. Wax pooled in his footprints, marking his passage like the tracks of something that was no longer entirely human. "Shall we go?" he asked, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with frequencies beyond mortal hearing. One by one, they approached the glowing window. The field of graves looked peaceful in its way, a place where the war's casualties could rest, regardless of which side they had served or what causes they had died for. The figure in tattered robes looked up as they approached, its face hidden beneath a hood that might have been shadow or might have been something more substantial. Krell reached out to touch the surface of the window, expecting to encounter glass or some other barrier. Instead, his hand passed through as if the opening were made of nothing more substantial than light and hope. The air on the other side smelled of turned earth and growing things, with an undertone of something that might have been incense or might have been decay. "Together," he said, though he was not sure why the word seemed important. Together, they stepped through the window and into a world where truth and beauty danced their eternal waltz among the graves of those who had believed in neither. Behind them, the listening post completed its transformation, dissolving into light and possibility, leaving no trace that it had ever existed, except in the memories of men who were no longer quite what they had been. The figure in tattered robes continued its planting, neither welcoming nor dismissing them, absorbed in the delicate work of coaxing life from soil watered with the tears of the illuminated. Above them, the blood-colored sky began to rain, each drop carrying within it the distilled essence of every prayer ever spoken in desperation and every lie ever told from love. They walked among the graves, these soldiers who had seen the face of illumination and lived to carry its burden. The flowers bloomed around their feet in colors that had no names, fed by earth that had been consecrated by the simple recognition that truth and falsehood were often indistinguishable, and that perhaps the difference mattered less than the choice to continue walking forward into whatever waited beyond the next horizon. In the distance, other windows began to open, other squads began to step through, all of them carrying the same weight of revelation, all of them seeking the same impossible reconciliation between what they had learned and what they still hoped might be possible. The war continued, but it was no longer the same war they had been fighting. This was something new, a conflict between those who had seen clearly and those who still clung to the comfortable blindness of absolute certainty. And in the spaces between the battles, in the quiet moments when the guns fell silent and the prayers stopped echoing, truth and beauty continued their eternal dance, creating meaning from meaninglessness and hope from the ashes of abandoned faith. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from their hands but never quite cleansing the stains from their souls. And they walked on through fields where the dead grew flowers and the living learned to tend gardens of crystallized tears.